Good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone here. I know that not all of us are here yet, and just as a reminder, this is a public event. It is going to be recorded. I expect that people are going to drop in and out over the course of the day, but we should probably get started because we have a lot to talk about, a lot of collections as data work that I'm excited to hear about, and I gather that each of you are excited to hear about each other's work. So I'm gonna get us started, if that's okay with you all. So we're here today to have the Collections as Data Part to Whole Cohort 2 Summative Forum. The primary purpose of this event is to provide an opportunity for re-grantee projects in the Collections as Data Part to Whole projects to report out on all of their work. And honestly, work that has been executed during a really difficult time. And I'm super appreciative to all of them for their dedication to this work and for carving out the time today to talk about that work with each other, and then obviously with the broader community. And let's see. So first, we have to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation who funded this project, Collections as Data Part to Whole. Thank you to Mellon. You know, a lot of our work wouldn't be possible across the cultural heritage community without you. We do have a code of conduct for all Collections as Data events and activities. So we want to be a welcoming and an inclusive experience and community. And the too long didn't read version of this is that if there any harassment occurs, it's not acceptable. And I'd encourage you to report any harassment that you may experience if you do experience it to having a little bit of a delay. To myself, I'm Thomas Padilla, Hannah Skates-Kettler, Stuart Varner, or Yasmin Shorish. All of them are on this call. All the project team for Collections as Data Part to Whole. Feel free to contact any of us if you do experience issues. Today, we're going to hear from projects at Louisiana State University, the University of Arizona, Harvard University and the University of Richmond, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Claremont Colleges, Florida International University, or FIU, and University of Florida, or UF. This is the rough schedule. All the times are in Pacific Standard, and part of that is because I'm in Las Vegas. So this event will be hitting each project at different times, and this is part of the the engagement with space and time that a national project means, right? So I'm in the morning. Some of us are almost noon. Some of us are noon. Some of us are afternoon. Some of the international participants are I'm not sure where they are in time, space and time, but thank them for engaging with us. So, relatively concise 20-minute presentations from each project team, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. And then we'll have 10-minute breaks at each hour and then reconvene. All of the project deliverables are available for the first 6 projects in this larger project, Collections as Data Part to Whole. And many of the deliverables are available from Cohort 2, which is the other 6 institutional projects that we're going to be hearing from today. Those can be found on our Open Science Framework page. There's a short link there. This presentation is going to be recorded. We're also going to write sort of a wrap-up post after the event. So don't try and furiously write down this link, or maybe do if you're really excited about it, but it will be coming in multiple forms to you, in the coming days and weeks. Why is Thomas showing an animated GIF of a sad leaf? I don't know. To me, this was evocative of a moment where I just wanted to stop, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, and just say thank you to all of the teams on these projects that worked on Collections as Data, right? They worked on a project that is in an effort and a community that is interesting and exciting to us. But I don't think I just speak for myself in saying that interest and excitement hasn't always been enough over the past 2 years to actually marshal us to do something, in the face of all the, social, political, health-oriented catastrophes that we've been encountering. I know that it's been really difficult to do any work at all, and I just wanted to recognize you all for doing this work in spite of everything, for being supportive of each other, and for extending a lot of grace, I think, with yourself and with your colleagues. Okay, so collections as data part to whole. Broad aim of this project, if you've not encountered it before, the aim is to foster the development of broadly viable models that support implementation and use of collections as data. As a whole, the 12 institutional projects that have been supported through this larger project have spanned more than 12 different institutions, a mix of large private universities, small private universities, big public R1s, small historical societies, art museums, a bunch of different kinds of places. And that was an intentional decision. When we were considering embarking on this project, there was a question of whether or not significant amount of funding should be allocated to one institution to essentially solve collections as data. And at the time we thought, well, that's not really in the spirit of the work, right? And that's not really in the spirit of inclusivity. And in terms of, charting multiple paths into doing collections as data work for different kinds of institutions, small, large, different community responsibilities, different resources, different kinds of collections, different aspirations. And so what we did was we essentially intentionally tried to diversify the pool of institutions that were experimenting in this space so that we could articulate multiple pathways into doing this kind of work, rather than sort of one normative bar that would be really hard for the rest of the community to meet. So that was intentional. And today we're going to hear from a bit more than six of these institutions from the larger set are going to report on their work over the past couple of years. In their work, we have encouraged them to focus on ethically grounded creation of machine actionable collections, computational use by specific communities, demonstrated capacity to serve underrepresented communities. We have worked to discourage contingent or temporary labor because of the difficulties of supporting it, sustaining it, local sustainability, and then also in their work and developing the deliverables in their projects, we've encouraged them to think about ready potential for adaptability by other institutions. So collections as data part to whole, 2 high-level aims. Models that sort of chart sustainable cross-organizational implementation of collections as data and responsible use of collections as data, right? No repetition of private sector terribleness. The cohorts work to create what we call implementation models, organizational models, and new collections that speak to underrepresented histories. The cohort teams consisted not entirely of, but at the core of a senior administrator to help clear administrative roadblocks in the work because of the cross-organizational nature. You kind of need someone to work across those areas, a project lead and disciplinary scholar to ensure sort of investment into particular communities or to help ensure that. These projects have produced a lot, right? I've just showed sort of a sampling here. There's been sort of, deliverables that, engage very directly with students at the pedagogical level, deliverables that aim to increase the granularity of discovery and search for collections, both text-based and image-based and moving image-based, and also really comprehensive and thoughtful community development activities. So for example, with the Louisiana Digital Library and their speaker series, just being one aspect. More broadly, and I'm not sure that the subgrantees know this, the folks that are going to be speaking today, but their work has been serving as a catalyst or an inspiration for a broader international community in collections as data. I've been searching around to keep tabs on these things. And so, for example, there is a national effort underway in Belgium right now to initiate a collections as data community that specifically cites this project and the project that came before it as an inspiration for a national initiative in Belgium to move collections as data forward there. And so that is entirely the product of, you know, your work, right? You are inspiring other people. You are suggesting various ways to do this work, and that's super exciting. And then we continue to see things like this every year or so. We see specific FTE positions created, like at the University of College London, focused on participatory research and collections as data. So you really all deserve a hand. Give you like a clap, because you've done your work, but through your work, you've also inspired a broader international community. And that's super exciting. I do want to say quickly to save the date, we will be holding an International Collections as Data Summit, fingers crossed if it's possible, in Chicago in the late spring, likely in May. Who knows, we may make it a hybrid event. As you all know, anticipating the impacts of COVID are an up and down proposition. But we do feel like we're in a position now where it makes sense to hold a multi-day international summit focused on connecting our international partners that are doing collections as data work and collaboratively framing next steps as not just as a national community, but as a global community. So save the date for that. This is our slate of talks today. Super excited to hear from all of them. And I want to hand off the baton now to Sophie at Louisiana State University to speak about their work. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, Thomas, can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me well and see my slide? Thomas, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know if Thomas can, but I think the rest of us can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. And can you see my slide? Could I get a brief confirmation on that?
No.
No, okay.
It shows that you've started screen sharing, but I don't see any image.
Okay. Let me stop my share and try that again. How about now? Any luck? Oh, it says it's paused. Does anybody know what that would be?
I mean, Thomas, you can check the participant settings and make sure they have full permissions.
Yeah, we'll do that now. Just one moment. Apologies for the technical difficulties.
There we go. But
So that one worked. Let's see if I can share my correct screen. Hold on one second. Okay, are we able to see it here?
yes.
Big thumbs up, fantastic. This
Great.
is, I'm just demonstrating to everybody how this type of thing goes. And doing a presentation during COVID. Here we go. All right. Okay, you're able to see my screen and just my screen? Is that still true? All right, thank you for that thumbs up. I am almost done configuring my space. Okay, goodness gracious, everybody. Hello, so sorry about that. So happy to be here, Thomas, and everybody on this team that got us here, that got a whole cohort this far into the project. Thank you all so much. It has been quite the journey for us at Louisiana State University. I assume that's true of everybody else. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I'm the head of digital programs and services at Louisiana State University Libraries. And today I'm talking about our LSU project and 25 of our closest friends. Oh, my notes out of the way now, everybody. All right, thank you so much. All right, so this is what we'll talk about really fast. So we'll start with the motivation for doing this work. Then I'll talk about the project in some detail, then some lessons that others might take from this. And finally, I'll talk about how we plan to continue this work after the end of the grant. So first up is motivation. So I'll start by talking about the Louisiana Digital Library, which is what our project focuses on. So this is our statewide digital library. LSU Libraries is the technical home, and institutions around the state participate by adding content. Among collaborative digital libraries, we're atypical in that with only two exceptions. We are not harvesting from our member institutions. Rather, each participating institution is able to sign in and upload their own content directly to the LDL. So this decentralized accession model is born of necessity. The majority of our members cannot afford on their own to have digital libraries, and without the LDL, they'd have nowhere to showcase their digital cultural heritage materials at all. This model also has interesting outcomes, one of which is that in a very real sense, right, nobody actually knows what's in the LDL. Content is being added all the time by people scattered across the state. This also means that building and maintaining a sense of community and shared purpose among our diverse set of members is something of a challenge. And because we are scattered around the state and rarely have the opportunity to come together for sustained conversations, this project offered a much needed opportunity for us to think together. So for example, when I first started in my position in 2018, I worked with developers here at LSU Libraries to start building tools to allow for bulk downloads and other collections as data-centered changes to the LDL. But then we stopped, right? Because we never had a chance to talk to all the LDL folks about these changes. And make sure that this is actually something that fits well with how they foresee their digital projects being used. So this project allowed us to take up these tools again, but with the input of the whole community of practitioners, not just those of us at LSU Libraries. Another motivation includes Louisiana's proclivity to natural disasters. This goes back, I think, a little bit to what Thomas was saying at the very beginning, but here specifically from our point of view, right, this project fits within a wider suite of initiatives to promote the digital cultural heritage of the state with an urgency based on a knowledge that things will only get worse from here. And I also admit that there is sort of something along the lines of a home state pride, sort of wrapped up in this, right? I don't think it's too controversial to say that not too many people expect great things coming out of Louisiana. And unfortunately, that sort of bleeds onto us a little bit, where we don't tend to think of ourselves as institutions where great things happen. And I feel like a project like this is a good opportunity to sort of show that if we can do it here, especially with the grounding in ethics that we've been focusing on and representation, that of course y'all can do it where you are. So the project, right? So we called it in 25 of our closest friends because at the time there were 26 members, right? So LSU and then 25 others. And this name was meant to be a way for being sure to show our intention of including everybody. Luckily in general, but confusingly for us, the LDL kept growing. And by the time we started the project, we were already way past 25. So now we're somewhere around 30. So instead, we just tend to call it LDL as data to make sure that it includes everybody. Our team consists of 4 people. So Leah Powell Duncan is our disciplinary scholar focusing on teachers and researchers who use the LDL. Elizabeth Joan Kelly is our disciplinary scholar focusing on LDL practitioners. And to a large extent, how it is that they think about the work that they do for putting content into the LDL. Gina Costello is our administrative lead, ensuring that the project remains relevant to and supported by LSU libraries. And then I served as the project lead, did a lot of project management, I did a lot of logistics, outreach, promotion, and these types of presentations. So we structured our team to have 2 disciplinary scholars because we thought of ourselves as having 2 large audiences. So the end users of the LDL, including educators and researchers, and also the practitioners and the LDL institutions who add content. So the central aim of our project is to investigate how we could make the entirety of the LDL available as data, right? So not simply a collection within it, but to ensure that all the material within the LDL could be used just as easily outside the interface as within the interface. And we know that we would have both a technology and a community angle to this. And we wanted the community to determine the technology. So the bulk of our work has been on the community side. For example, we wanted to find out whether or not something like this is what all the 30+ LDL participants want. We wanted to ask questions about whether or not collections as data is appropriate for all the collections within the LDL and who gets to decide that. And how can we as a group consider the ethical implications as well as the promise of collections as data at the LDL level. And also we wanted to spend time thinking about, given our great variation in institution type, staffing models, etc., what could this even look like at a statewide digital library? So the community focused work involved a bunch of great things, including an intro survey, which we did way back at the beginning, in which we gathered information about what LDL folks were doing in terms of selection for digitization and applying rights statements and tracking use and reuse of their collections. We also asked about to what extent anyone thinks about their collections as data and the ethical implications of the collections that we build. Oh, sorry. So for the survey, we were trying to create a benchmark of where as a community of practitioners we were in terms of the big themes of the project. Then we had an introductory meeting in which we got as many people together as possible and talked about the survey results and the grant things that were coming up. And we brainstormed about how to keep in touch with sort of communication we're all after and would be best for us. And to help keep us all on the same page, we created a series of sample projects and tutorials to help use the LDL content as data and to help everyone be sure that we're all visualizing the same type of work here. So the first tutorial demonstrated how to use oral history transcripts in the LDL to create text corpora and how to explore these using Voyant. The second tutorial demonstrates how to gather geographic data from the LDL and how to use Google Maps and other mapping softwares to visualize that data. All of these sample projects and tutorials are available as recordings through our website, and a big thank you to our team member Leah for putting these together. I know a lot of people get a lot of use out of them. We also did an online speaker series that we saw just a little bit of in the introduction. We had in total 8 speakers with presentations that focused on a number of topics that we identified as central to our project. I'll highlight just some of them here, not quite all of them. But we had Dorothy Berry talk about her ongoing project at Harvard University Libraries to identify collections traditionally marginalized in the collections and how you can elevate these through digitization selection. So the name of her talk was Centering Margins in Digital Project Planning. Tonya Sutherland talked to us about her work around investigating redescription as reparative justice and the work she's doing to study how description choices are being made at repositories across North America. Jacqueline Wernemont talked about the intersections of feminist ethics of care in collections as data, using the Eugenics Rubicon project as a case study, and how we can care for the people represented in our collections. And Alejandro Torres drew from her experience in public school education to give us examples of how digital libraries in general, and the LDL specifically, can be used in the classroom to foster a holistic education that centers the lived experience of students. In December of last year, we had a focus group. So we tried to get as many people together again as possible of LDL practitioners specifically to talk about everything that was happening and everything that we've already completed and the directions that we were going. And this was a chance to hear a lot of great ideas that have influenced work moving forward since that point. We launched the LDL Fellowship to continue the process of building examples using LDL collections as data. And one suggestion that we got from the focus group that I just mentioned was to have more relatively informal means of getting together virtually, right? So just ways to talk about what we're doing and to see the work from other people. So to act on this, we started to have monthly lunch at the virtual library brown bag events in which fellows present about their projects. And then to supplement that, we'll also hear either from an LDL member or a scholar working on something similar. And then finally, we had an outro survey in which we evaluated if and to what extent the grant affected the work of our LDL colleagues. So in short, most of the respondents plan to change multiple aspects of how they select for digitization and how they describe content. But a major struggle continues to be staffing and the time and resources to develop in-house expertise, right? So overall, a lot of positive feedback about the project, I'm happy to say, but we do know that we still have a lot of work to do, which we'll talk a little bit about in just a moment. And then based on everything we learned from everything we did, we now know that we'll need technology changes from both the angle of the software that the LDL runs on, but also additional services that we can offer to the two communities, right? So in terms of the software of the LDL itself, we'll be focusing and have already begun focusing on ensuring that bulk downloads are easier, and that files that a user gets are meaningfully named, right? We'll also be emphasizing, interface changes that ensure that right statements are clearly presented. This again is from direct feedback from both of our communities, as well as this next change that we've also implemented metadata fields at the item level, specifically for content notes, warnings, context, anything that we might want to say about an item. Its historical context is often a common one. So we'll have a single metadata field for these to help us display them in a standard way and to make sure that's also downloaded and moved from system to system with the rest of the data. Outside the LDL software specifically, we have identified a number of needs. For example, many scholars and end users have told us that the #1 roadblock to them using LDL content for digital projects and LDL materials as data specifically is finding and maintaining a place to host these. So we'll be offering hosting options for people who want to use the LDL content for digital projects. I'm very, very happy about that. We've also been told, and I'm sure this will not be a surprise to most of you, that the one big thing we could do to help is to help people render collections as data, right? So to that end, we'll be experimenting with offering handwritten text recognition services to users. A lot of people have identified, I really love this collection. It's handwritten 150 years ago. Please, what can you do to help us? So we'll really be leaning into seeing what sort of services we can supply for that. And so, right, so what are some of the lessons that our project might be able to offer to other projects? First of all, data is about people, and I know y'all are being nice, but I know this sounds like a cliche. Hold on, let me explain. So when I said data is about people, right? So I'm referencing the centrality of our community work, how we prioritize the people who do digital library work and the people who use what we create, right? So I'm drawing attention to the fact that only by focusing on people could our projects be a success. But I also mean something else. I mean that we focused on understanding that the collections and the LDL are about people, like literally about people, right? So there are images and postcards of buildings and places too, for sure, right? But what we really spent a lot of our time thinking about were the people in the collections, like how they're described, which people are represented, which people are not represented, and what this means for the story of Louisiana we're telling through the LDL. So when I'm thinking about the future project, what a future project may get from looking at ours, I think about the role of people as actors, as objects, and as a constant among the shifting technology and competing demands on our attention. And I'm also thinking, one of the biggest takeaways that I have from this personally is that it doesn't have to be fancy, but it does have to be well articulated and locally relevant. So much of our project is based around how to move together as a community, right? So this means, of course, that we will not move fast, but it also means that we're not likely to have a lot of fancy things. I think a big takeaway from our project is that fanciness isn't necessary. Rather, spending time on examples grounded in the material of your community is central. So we needed to clearly articulate what we thought very busy librarians and archivists working in often very small shops, what they needed to know, right? And why they should care about this type of thing, which is why we were focusing on people. So here I'm thinking about the sample tutorials on how to get data from specific LDL collections and how to use that data somewhere else. Specific examples from educators and end users about how they need the collections outside the interface. And how it is that aligns with our job, and how this is not just something nice to have on the side, but is actually a core concern of meeting the needs of our users. So next steps for our collections as data efforts. I'm actually very happy with the way we've been able to operationalize a lot of this. So we'll continue to offer hosting and datafication services for users, making necessary adjustments, right, as we continue to get feedback, but I'm also happy to say that we have focused on operationalizing our work, which in many cases looks like building these concerns directly into the policy of the LDL. For example, expectations that our participants will use standardized right statements and take seriously cultural sensitivity concerns are now part of the submission agreement that institutions sign when working with the LDL. And I also think that community expectations of what a collaborative digital library project should look like have evolved with us over the project. And I think now we all expect this type of work to continue regardless of future technology changes or staff turnovers. And that was really one of our, what we knew was going to be one of the biggest hurdles, right? If you're moving together as a community, we really need to think about how we can ensure that if this is something we want, then we want it as a community, so that if somebody leaves their job or if we have to update our technology, we weren't gonna be okay with it, the premise disappearing, right? We know any future technology suites that we use are going to need this. Any future hires that we do will need to be on board with this. Future steps will also include looking closely at the blockers identified in the surveys, right? So though respondents were mostly in favor of re-examining their selection for digitization practices and promoting collections as data, they identified a number of issues, including a lack of in-house expertise and general lack of staffing in their shops. So these are the types of findings that we can use when planning collaborative projects in the future and for future grants. For example, we can prioritize training and sharing across institutions, which is something we've begun doing. And now I feel like this really helps us with the impetus and will really help shape future directions. Oh, and y'all, we founded a journal, the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship. Its first issue came out last month and featured invited papers from the LDL as Data Speaker Series, and we plan to use this journal as a way to build community around critical approaches to digital librarianship, especially those that incorporate feminist, queer, and other critical frameworks, and of course, collections as data. So it's our hope that this will serve as a gathering space for work that allows us all to learn together. And that's it. Thank you. That's all I have today. Thank you for listening. A big thank you to the project team, and a big thank you to all the wonderful LDL folks who made this a success. Thank y'all.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophia. I know people are probably burning with questions. So we're going to hold those a little bit. We're going to hear from University of Arizona, and then we'll do like a joint Q&A across the projects. I think that's you, Mary. I think you're up.
Yep, I'll take it away here. And I'm going to share my screen, but then I'm also going to turn my camera off just for my bandwidth here. So let me know if you do not see my slides once I do this here. Okay, can you all see that? Good, okay, thank you. So, hey everybody, I am Mary Feeney. I'm the News Research Librarian and Liaison Librarian for History, Journalism, and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona Libraries. And I was the project lead for our Collections as Data project, which has a long title I will read to you. Using newspapers as data for collaborative pedagogy, a multidisciplinary interrogation of the borderlands in undergraduate classrooms. And so, I'll talk a little bit about our motivation. My colleagues and I were super excited about the possibilities when we first learned about applying for the second cohort of the Collections as Data Part to Whole initiative. We saw it as a really great opportunity for exploring new ways of using the Borderlands newspapers that we had actually digitized earlier for the UA Library's Historic Mexican and Mexican American Press digital collection, as well as Arizona newspapers digitized for the National Digital Newspaper Program through a partnership we had a couple of years ago with the State Library of Arizona. And so we gathered a group of disciplinary faculty members, some of whom we had worked already with, and to talk about ideas for using newspapers as data, and then that led to this collaboration. Okay, so our project brought together a cross-library and cross-campus group of library faculty and staff with disciplinary scholars in English, history, journalism, and Spanish. And we worked together to introduce students to computational analysis using these digitized historical newspapers from Arizona. So as I mentioned, I was the project lead. Anita Huizar-Hernández in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese was the disciplinary lead. And Sarah Shreeves, the library's vice dean, was the administrative lead. But we also had several other project team members who all contributed, and that it included Celeste Gonzalez de Bustamante in journalism, Maria McWhorter, who's the director of the UA Public History Collaborative, Catherine Morrissey in history, Cristina Ramirez in English, and then from the libraries, Jeff Oliver and Megan Sensini from our research engagement department, and Erica Castaño and Veronica Reyes Escudero from Special Collections. So this is a screenshot of the top part of our project webpage where you can find all the information that I'm going to talk about today. We've got links to a lot of different things there. Okay, so for this project, as I mentioned, we focused on Borderlands newspapers, and I'm just going to say a little bit about each one of these. So you can see the range of what we were working with. So really the big one there is El Tusanense, and that was really central to our project. It's a Spanish language newspaper that was published in Tucson, Arizona for most of the first half of the 20th century. And then two papers published by African Americans in Phoenix, which was the Phoenix Tribune and the Arizona Sun. The Apache Sentinel, which was a newspaper published at Fort Huachuca by Black soldiers that were stationed there back in the early 1940s. El Sol, a Spanish language paper published for many years in Phoenix. The Arizona Post, which was a Jewish newspaper published in Tucson. And then two white-owned newspapers that were digitized under earlier NDNP grants. The Border Vedette, that was published in Nogales, Arizona. And for anyone who's not familiar with our region, Nogales, Arizona shares a border with Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. So it's a true Borderlands paper. And then in the early part of, that was in the early part of the 20th century. And then also the Bisbee Daily Review. Okay, so like everyone else participating in Collections as Data, we had to quickly adjust to doing our work remotely since this had been awarded in January 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was starting. So we had to quickly adjust. But the library faculty held online workshops for the project team, which was intended to be in person, but we spread this out over a few weeks, and that included an introduction to text mining, an overview of the newspaper content, and then talking about context for using newspapers in research. And then hands-on Jupyter Notebook lesson to learn how to text mine using Python, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Okay, and then so during the summer of 2020, the disciplinary faculty developed lessons for their courses in those different disciplines I talked about. And they were developing lessons that would incorporate the Jupyter Notebook lessons that Jeff, our data science specialist, had created. And then in the fall 2020 and spring 2021 semesters, they introduced text mining in their courses using various assignments. So they had, some had students make short videos, Adobe Spark presentations that incorporated visualizations that they had created with the Jupyter Notebook, and then along with their own interpretation and analysis and other research. Students researched different topics, some that we hadn't really planned on, but made a lot of sense at the time was the 1918 influenza pandemic, women's suffrage, and immigration. And so another sort of interesting challenge was that all the courses ended up being taught online because of COVID, and some of them were actually taught asynchronously. So that was a little bit of a challenge. But what we did was the library faculty created tutorials for the students like this one to introduce them to the newspaper content. And another one that was an introduction to text mining. And that way they could be used in these asynchronous and online courses. And then really critically and most central to the project, there was the Jupyter Notebook lesson. Jeff provided, he created all of this, and he also provided an online hands-on workshop for the classes. So over Zoom, teaching students how to do this. Here you can see part of the Jupyter Notebook and a sample graph created using it. And so all of this, all the tutorials, the Jupyter Notebook lessons, all of the text data files are all available open access from our project page, so anyone can use them. Another part of our project was that we wanted to have a student showcase. And again, because everything was remote, we had to adapt it to a virtual one. And so the student showcase is also linked on our project page. This is just an example of students' work that's highlighted. It's a screenshot from an Adobe Spark presentation from the Spanish course in which the student narrates her presentation. And this student incorporated the graphs that she made using the Jupyter Notebook, and then her analysis, she talks about her analysis of the results. So you can see one of the graphs here, which shows word frequency for influenza, gripa, and gripe in El Tusanense from 1917 to 1919. And this is just another example. This is from a VoiceThread, which is type of teaching tool from the history course. It was a course on the natural history of disasters. And so they had a module on pandemics, and the students used the text mining techniques to look at Arizona historical newspaper coverage of the 1918 influenza pandemic. So in the video, which you can see on the showcase, Dr. Morrissey talks about the project, and here you can see a comparison of graphs of word frequency of mask and mascara from the Border Vedette, the Bisbee Daily Review, and El Tusanense. And in the video, the students are interacting and interpreting the visualizations by commenting on the VoiceThread as so they sort of talk through these text mining results together. Okay, I'm probably talking really quickly here. Sorry, I'm trying to get through a lot of information. We also showcase student work from the journalism course, a graduate level English class about archival research methods. And in that course, the students looked at topics like immigration and labor, women's suffrage. One of the great things about being able to extend the timeline of the grant was that we were also able to incorporate the text mining lessons in the spring 2021 semester. So that gave us more of a chance to use this. And that included a 6-week-long binational journalism research project called Hidden Voices. And so this is an example of one of the student projects in which they examine news coverage of the Braceros program. And so this is an interactive timeline that the group created, and you can kind of see one of their Jupyter Notebook graphs that they created there. So, part of this also, because this was very pedagogically focused, we also asked the students to reflect on their experiences with using text mining and using newspapers as data. So you can see a few of the comments here. Some of them talked about the usefulness of this activity for understanding the vocabulary in historical documents. Some talked about how it can add to our understanding of history, or sort of a different way of looking at history. When we asked what they thought the best part of the text mining activity was, some of them commented that they liked learning about the newspapers themselves, sort of the newspaper history. And then others commented on the coding process itself. So you can see that quote there, but I'll read it to you. That one student said, "I was afraid of it, to be honest. Coding or altering code struck me as something a bit beyond my grasp. That was the challenge. What surprised me was how intuitive it ended up being and how illuminating the results were." And then finally, well, not finally, but another thing we did was we hosted a public online symposium in May, just this past May, that featured a keynote presentation by Dr. Huizar-Hernández, who some of you probably know. She's the Public and Digital Humanities Postdoc Fellow at the University of Kansas. And then the symposium also included roundtable discussions and presentations about our partnerships. So we talked a lot about how the library and the disciplinary scholars work together, how they implemented text analysis in multidisciplinary classes. Originally, we were going to just work with undergraduate classes, but we ended up including a graduate symposium as well. And then we also previewed that virtual student showcase. That was really great that we could still hold that symposium even in the middle of the pandemic. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of our lessons learned in this project. And I'll start with talking about staffing and expertise. So this is a photo of part of our group. There's a few people missing here, but this was obviously pre-pandemic. I think this was literally the last meeting we had before everything shut down. So we, we're in the same room together and not wearing masks. But the collaboration and support for the project came from across the library. So that included liaison librarians, data science specialists, special collections, and that gave us a range of expertise to work with the disciplinary faculty and their students. That included knowledge about the newspapers themselves, computational methodologies, technical support, etc. And so one of our lessons, I guess, that we would want to pass on is that for other libraries who may want to use this model, we recommend drawing from across your organization and really tapping into that expertise from the start of the project, or even from the proposal phase, because everybody had something to bring to this project. We also really want to emphasize that the need for intensive computational support for collections as data in classes, you don't want to underestimate that. As I mentioned, Jeff, who you can actually see in the picture there, he is, with his position, he's dedicated to data literacy, but if you don't have that type of support, there's training available from software carpentry and library carpentry that might be useful. But that was something that was really a lot of time involved in that. And then talking about the collection. So this happened around this collection of newspapers that I've talked about, and which some of us were very familiar with the content because we'd worked on the digitization projects and we work with researchers. It was also a collection of papers that had already been digitized, so we were able to use them. We also were working with disciplinary faculty partners who were already really interested and engaged and brought their disciplinary expertise to the collaboration. So we were able to work with these newspapers as data, the collection as data in different ways, as you could see from that showcase. So one thing that, to pass on is that for our own future projects, as well as anyone else's projects, it would be helpful to kind of think about what type of collections as data would have that same level of collaboration, that could foster that same level of collaboration. And then we do want to mention that we were working with newspapers that were diverse in terms of languages and communities. That was really important to us and a focus of this project. But also to note that there are so many other newspapers and other materials in non-English languages and from underrepresented communities that have not been digitized. And, so there's that limit when you look at collections as data. So of course, a lesson for all of us is that collectively we need to continue to invest more in the digitization of underrepresented content. Okay, and then so technical considerations, and I will say, I pulled these lessons learned from Jeff. So if people have questions about the technical stuff, I may not be as well versed in answering them. But one thing to note is that most of these students were in humanities and social sciences classes, and so they had very little, if any, experience with text mining or writing computer code. So the approach was that it was really important for us to scaffold lessons for the courses. So we provided context about the data set, the newspapers themselves, like they needed to understand the collection that they were working with. And they needed an introduction to just the basics of what text mining even is. And then a scaffolded, easy to use data set, and of course the support with computational tools. So the hands-on work that Jeff did with the Jupyter Notebook. And then, as I said, this was material that was already digitized, publicly available materials from Chronicling America and the UA Library's Mexican American Press digital collection. But the collection as data itself required the assembling of these many different newspaper pages into single issue level files with Python scripts, which of course Jeff handled. And he's included details about the scripts in GitHub, which is linked from a project page. And then all of the data as well, which of course he's assembled, are available in the U of A's research data repository. And so one of the lessons learned for us is that for anyone doing similar work, to be aware of, even if you're working with a, quote, digital collection, that there's an amount of pre-processing that is needed to be able to actually use them as data. Let's see. So, and then the other technical consideration is that the courses had a hands-on lesson to use Python. As I mentioned, they were analyzing mostly word frequencies over time. And, these classes took place online. So that was going to be a challenge. So Jeff had written the Python code, all of this code, it's in the Jupyter Notebook. And then with the hands-on sessions, the students can kind of be walked through how to do this and feel a little bit more comfortable doing something that was very new to them. And then the other thing that, again, I'm passing this on from Jeff because I'm not as familiar with it, but he used an online platform called MyBinder to host the Jupyter Notebook, which, and then also the data set is quite large. It's about 90,000 individual newspaper pages. So, because that would take processing time to deliver that during class, he had set up a sandbox Jupyter Notebook as well with a smaller set of the papers. Okay, and then let me, I'm sorry, I think I'm going over time a little bit, just a couple more slides. So some of the teaching considerations, lessons learned from our disciplinary faculty was that the scaffolding was really what helped lead to success, especially when you're teaching data science to humanities students. The disciplinary faculty each were able then to adjust that scaffolding based on their own disciplines, the objectives of their courses, what assignments they were doing, and then also the level of the courses. So we had, a general education students up through upper division undergrads, and then even a graduate seminar. And then, of course, with other digital research tools, this approach to the past opened up new questions for the students. So, for example, looking at Arizona newspaper coverage of the 1918 flu pandemic. But of course, it doesn't really answer those questions, right? It just sort of creates more questions and discussion. So part of what the students were learning was that these text mining results and their own analysis required them to do more research and to dig a little deeper. But one of our faculty members noted that actually provided for a really rich pedagogical resource to help the students approach those questions. I'll just also mention briefly, we all had to adjust because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but because so much of this was digitally focused and we were able to turn it into a digital teaching project, we were able to keep moving forward, thankfully. And then really just noting that the overall success of the project relied on these collaborations and partnerships across campus. So the disciplinary faculty, the library faculty and staff, data science. And then I also want to really point out that the adaptability of the students, right? So we did all this stuff for them and with them, but just the fact that they were able to adapt during this pandemic and learning something completely new to them in what was already a really challenging environment. So it was really rewarding to see what the students were able to do with it. Okay, and then real quickly, our next steps, we were thinking about sustainability. The staffing probably is most challenging because it required a concentrated amount of support for the computational data expertise. the newspaper collections data, expertise, and of course, project management. But, a couple of things we're thinking about is packaged data sets and tools that we could possibly provide for courses. Possibly training more staff and faculty to do this kind of work, like learning more through software carpentry. Of course, thinking about collections as data from the start, as we're starting to try to re-ramp up our digitization program. And then probably most importantly, from my perspective, is the continued collaborations across the library, as well as building on our relationships with disciplinary faculty. And then one other next step is that a few of our disciplinary faculty partners have received funding through, the library has a Mellon-funded Digital Borderlands initiative. And so Dr. Morrissey, Dr. Gonzalez de Bustamante, and Dr. Huizar-Hernández are working on a project called Reporting on Race and Ethnicity in the Borderlands, a data-driven digital storytelling hub. And just for the sake of time, I won't go into a lot of details, but part of what they're going to be doing is building on this newspapers as data project by expanding the newspaper data set and really building that out as a digital Borderlands research hub. Okay, and finally, I want to thank everyone on the project team. I know a lot of them couldn't be here today, but our disciplinary collaborators, my library colleagues, other people in the library who help support us. And then, of course, we also really want to thank Thomas, Hannah, Stuart, and Yasmin from the Collections as Data Part, the whole team. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now we have some time to open it up to a brief Q&A. So don't be shy.
Should we just hop in and ask Thomas? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. For both of the projects, I was impressed with how you took it out to the students, with the LDL project, creating the tutorials, and with the University of Arizona project, actually, engaging students through the Jupyter notebooks. And I just wondered if either one of you would want to talk a little bit about Mary, you talked a little bit about students' comfort level and them, trying to get used to the idea that they could code. But just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the students, kind of took this up or seemed like they either wanted to run with it or from it for both projects.
Yeah, that's a great way to, and I actually see that my colleague Jeff is here. So I wonder if he would be willing to hop on and address that, because he was really the one who was doing the hands-on coding with the students. Jeff, are you willing to chime in? I think he was here. Sorry, he may have left. Yeah, I think it was, I think having that hands-on, and when I say hands-on, it was like online hands-on, right? So it was online over Zoom, hands-on. But, Jeff worked really well with the students in kind of walking them through stuff. And I feel like that one student said, I was scared, but then once they saw that when someone provides you this sort of guided practice, it makes it a lot easier to do that. Oh, I don't know if anyone else is. I'm not sure if there was another response to that.
Oh, I can speak a little bit to it, and I think since you're asking about both projects. So yeah, our emphasis was on both an audience being end users like researchers, students, et cetera, as well as those of us who add content to the LDL, so sort of a community of practitioners there. And I'll answer your question sort of to the latter community, the community of practitioners, because again, I said this a little bit in the slides, but I think it bears repeating. A lot of the people we are working with, a lot of our colleagues here are really from very small institutions. They might be the only librarian or archivist, or just with one or two people. So one of the challenges that we saw was not so much, it's not really that we wanted to set them up so that they could actually do digital humanities projects on their own, but we wanted to set up a structure in which it was clear like what the heck we were even talking about. And that was really the emphasis for having these sort of sample projects. I hope that's clear. Like, we just needed to be like as succinct as possible. So like we're coming out of the gate talking about collections as data in computational analysis of humanities content, et cetera. But I mean, really, you know, what we were talking about is how to use Voyant, right, and how to make a map. So we just really needed that to be as concrete as possible. So I don't know. I hope that helps answer that question and give some context.
You know, and I'll just also mention, that made me think of something else while you were talking, that, you know, we all were learning. I mean, so, you know, we had varying degrees of experience with text mining within the library, almost none among the disciplinary faculty, and then of course the students. So we were learning along, and then before them, and getting comfortable ourselves before working with them. So it sort of gives you the perspective of like what it's going to be like to learn something new. So I think that helped as well, sort of giving a little bit of empathy to what the students might be going through. But honestly, as Jeff said in the chat, I think that they adapted really well, especially considering the situation that we were all in. Just so impressed with, and maybe it was just, you know, a nice distracting exercise for them as well to do something that was challenging, you know. But thanks for the question.
Great. And I see that Sally has their hand raised.
Hi, Sophie. Hi, Mary. Thank you very much for the inspiring talks. And I think Thomas mentioned our project. I'm from Belgium, and we've been very inspired by your project. So that is great. I just wondered if you've been thinking about the other end of the research, of the data, sort of research data management lifecycle here. It's really interesting because a lot of the emphasis is on the depositing of research data after the collections as data activities have gone on, and less at the front end with the collections as data. So we're trying to move the emphasis. And I just wondered, have you been thinking about after the collections as data has been moved and the analysis has been done, where you make that data available, and how you relate it to the original collections, the sort of interrelationship between the collections as data and then the derived data sets, let's say, as a result of analysis?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for joining us today. How delightful. I have thought about it. My team has thought about it. We are not fighters, but if you wanted to see us bicker, me and some of my colleagues, you should ask that question while we're sitting around having coffee. So we have a lot of conversations about how it is that we might link, for instance, a digital collection of photographs with a data set of geographic information extracted from that. You know, it depends on the technology for sure. So leaving that aside, though, I think it depends a lot on just, obviously your infrastructure will be different. So I just why I keep falling back to the community side of things. So we spent a lot of time trying to find out from our users how that would be helpful to find it, whether or not that should be grouped with the originally digitized content, for example, or whether or not that should be its own, you know, like data derivative collection stored elsewhere in the repository, and how it is we might be able to link those. But I would, Sally, I hope you don't mind, I would very much love to see what y'all come up with and take it, because this is something that we're starting to go into. But honestly, I don't know if I could come up with these examples off the top of my head, but we tried it both ways. We tried like grouping them together in one instance and having them separate, but with some sort of like, you know, HTML, hyperlink, you know, them together. And I mean, there's just so many pros and cons. I really don't think for my, you know, my team that we've come up with anything very useful to be able to share about that, with the exception of, yes, my goodness, do we ever think about it? But you know, eventually we'll be forced to, right? As as our number of data collections continue to increase. Let me stop here. Mary, did you have any input?
You know, I don't have too much to say about it, except that I think, you know, this was really the UA library's first sort of real foray into collections as data. I mean, people have done, you know, sort of their own research or whatever, but this was like our first entree, I guess, into it. And so I think we're still trying to figure that out. Like, as you build it out, what is it going to look like? You know, we have this project page that has information about the collections themselves. and the tutorials, and then it links out to GitHub and it links to the UA data research data repository. But that's for this project, right? And so then what happens if we start having more and more collections? I mentioned the project that some of our disciplinary faculty are going to work on, and they're going to have sort of their own, this digital hub. And, so again, that's going to be a little bit of a standalone thing as well. So sort of, I don't know if that's really answering the question, but I guess it's like, as it gets bigger, what are we going to do? And that's sort of what you've said, Sophie.
It's a fantastic question. I'm sure we could engage in more questions, and we will. But we are a bit over time. So I want to offer thanks to Mary and Sophie for talking so eloquently about their work. I want to ask us to break for 5 minutes now. And when we come back, we'll hear from Claremont, and we'll hear from the Harvard and the Richmond University team.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Hi, everyone. So I think it's been 5 minutes, so we're keeping things snappy, keeping it rolling. Jeanine, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh,
Good morning.
good. Okay, just wanted to double check. Just another housekeeping note. I've enabled talking for everyone. So during the Q&A, that should make it a bit less awkward. If you have a question, just feel free to turn off your mic and ask a question. So I don't want to take any more time away from our fantastic presenters. We have first up Claremont Colleges, and then we have Harvard University and Richmond University. But I'll hand it over to you, Jeanine, to talk about the work at Claremont.
Hi, good. I'm going to turn off my camera in the interest of bandwidth as well. Can we see the screen okay, everybody?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Sorry. Woo, we're still learning, aren't we? Let me get in the present mode here. There we go. I'm here representing the Claremont College's Library Bending Water Project. This was our collections as data application to the California Water Documents collection at the Claremont College's library. And I did want to take just a minute to explain, if you're not familiar with Claremont, we are a library that supports a consortium of institutions in Claremont. There are 7 different schools. There are 5 undergraduate liberal arts institutions and 2 graduate institutions. And the library is an entirely separate division, formula funded essentially by these schools. So it is extremely complicated organizational space. It's complicated in the best of times, and over this past 20 months, we've really sort of seen the struggles that an organization like this can present for projects like this. I will say that I really appreciated Thomas's little leaf GIF at the beginning, because I feel like this has been such a tremendous learning experience for us with a lot of challenges. We've had to extend everybody a lot of grace. I will warn you, I've kind of lost some of my filters and lost some of my chill in the past 20 months. I will keep it family friendly, but I feel like what we can present here is what we did, what we learned. And those are the things that I think we can contribute from Claremont for this conversation going forward. I will, spoiler alert, there's not a super tidy lessons learned slide because we're still processing that. But I appreciate this conversation very much. Who we are at Claremont. The project team as proposed was myself. I am the data science and digital scholarship coordinator at the library. With my supervisor, Jessica Dávila, is our director of digital scholarship and strategies. Char Miller was our disciplinary scholar. He is an endowed chair professor of EA and history at Pomona College. He does a lot of work on environmental analysis questions, environmental justice, the history of water, particularly in the West, and how its movement has been affected by power imbalances and social inequality and sort of the settler mindset that moved water around in the West. And I am pleased to share today with Catalina Lopez, our digital production lead project manager on this project. The first thing we did in this project was hire a project manager because we knew there would be a lot of moving pieces. And our library is sort of under-resourced in some of these spaces. We don't have an IT division. We don't have a lot of the things that some of the bigger institutions did. And Catalina really hit the ground running and was key to the success of a lot of this project. So the materials we were working with were the California Water Documents collection, which is a distinct collection within our library's digital library collection. These are scanned documents primarily from the 19th and 20th century water development in California. They are mostly materials that came from federal and state municipal level archives. They're deeds, surveys, there's field journals as sort of different surveyors and such went out into the fields, a lot of photographs, like this one, an early photograph of the LA aqueduct bringing the water down from the Central Valley into LA. Over 2017 and 2019, about 14,000 items from this collection were digitized with a Clear Hidden Collections grant. So our impetus in sort of bringing a collections as data approach to this was to sort of piggyback on this energy, piggyback on the communities of practice, communities of study that have grown up around these water documents. Char Miller and several other faculty members in environmental analysis and history have been coming to the library using those documents for quite a while. So we felt like we had a good community in place to begin using these collections. Our plan was to sort of look at what was already digitized and have conversations with disciplinary scholars, both our own at Claremont and the others in our region in Southern California who were involved with this collection. What was their priority? What was useful to them? And also reach out to our Native community members. There are several different Native nations in this part of California and in other parts of California whose water was the subject of these archives, right? So sort of engaging with conversations with them, we sort of knew, we had an idea of what areas were represented and what nations were represented. We didn't really know very well though. The other piece, the mechanical part, the project work, the OCR formatting of some of the tables in these documents as machine readable content, and georeferencing of the maps. There are a lot of hand-drawn maps, there's a lot of one-off quirky maps, getting these into a machine readable GeoTIFF file, which is the TIFF, the image as attached to a set of coordinates for latitude and longitude, so those can be pulled into different sort of geospatial analysis systems. And then the last piece is the deposit of these derived data sets into an open data repository. During the project time, we joined as a organizational member, the Dryad Data Repository, and the workflows and the other deliverable pieces for implementation are in our Open Science Frameworks repo. So as an example of, another piece of what's in this collection, these are some of the survey sheets. This is fairly typical of some of these items. This is a standardized form from the USGS, late 19th century. This is from Bishop, California, in Inyo County, which is sort of up in the Eastern Sierras. We knew this was there. We knew what it sort of represented, these sort of early efforts to get all that water and bring it down south, right? This is the story of water in California. So sort of looking at these pieces and seeing how they would be meaningful as data and meaningful as maps and meaningful in conversation with some of our community partners. In this process, our sort of key community partner was working with the Owens Valley Indian Water Commission. They are affiliated with the Bishop Paiute tribe up in Bishop, California. And this is a screenshot from their story map. There's a link there. And sort of in our early conversations, we met with Terry Red Owl, who's the executive director of this group, and some of her collaborators and researchers. It's not history, right? This is their current engagement there in Owens Valley. They are trying to get this water back, and in trying to get this water back, they want to understand where it came from. So we sort of began this conversation understanding how they identified where these pieces of land up in Bishop County were that were, sold to settlers or, obtained by California, and sort of finding out how to have these conversations of what was in our archives that came from settler institutions and archives of municipalities, how that supports their work and how we can sort of engage in this conversation. It's not simple. We knew that this would be sort of a making visible what is not visible in this collection. For example, our early searches of the materials from Southern California did not have the word Tongva in them, which is the ancestral lands here in Southern California where we are. So our deliverables as planned, there's a lot of asterisks in 2020, 2021, aren't there? Our implementation plan was how we made our collection available as data, our surveys, our assessments, our interview protocols, who we conversed with, also our workflows, the technical bits. The data set are the derived data sets that we deposit into Dryad and to other repositories as needed. The use plan was going to be staff and user profiles and a plan for community engagement. That's probably been the most changed, and I think that probably is true across our cohort, sort of that use profile when we've been online and virtual and had to do so many pivots has changed a lot. The timeline, this is an asterisk. It's not the timeline we proposed, but it's sort of the timeline we are living with. The assessment and outreach of our collection took pretty much all the time that we had in 2020. It was fortunately a project that worked well to be distributed. We had student staff we wanted to keep busy. We had, staff we wanted to keep busy. We wanted to be able to work remotely and keep this project moving forward. Project work and outreach sort of continued from fall and still going on. We're still wrapping up some pieces. Documentation and sustainability, that has mostly been sort of spring and summer of this year. So the first piece was sort of getting our hands and heads around what was in this collection. I'm not sure why that middle section is blurred, but the collection as it came out of the Clear Assessing Hidden Collections project had about 1,400 objects. We initially narrowed those down to everything that had sort of a data set tag in it. And from that, we sort of went through another pass in our first assessment, understanding what that meant when they tagged something data set. Was it a chart? Was it a map? Was it a table? How many? Was it 20 pages of tables? Was it a half a page of a table? Sort of scoping out that work was an initial first pass that sort of took a good part of 2020 to sort of figure out that workflow and figure out the best way to start approaching that. And outreach sort of occurred and will continue to occur in tandem. And I think that probably is true for a lot of these projects across the cohort, and as we sort of morph into sustainable pieces within our libraries. Some of our early conversations were with our nearby partners at the UCLA Institute of Environment and Sustainability. We had a conversation with their water group, which is a hugely interdisciplinary space, which is part of the challenge that was that we encountered with this collection, was that water history, water research touches so many different disciplines and so many different perspectives. I think we were a little unprepared for the extent and the intensity of that interdisciplinary conversation. A member of that group was Mendoza, who's a master's now graduate of UCLA, produced a movie as part of her master's thesis called The Aqueduct Between Us. There is a link there, I can share it later, but that movie that she has up on YouTube, explaining the history of water movement from the Paiute lands up in Central California down to Southern California, and the relationship that is expressed with water and between tribal nations in California, how that water has moved. She speaks with Tongva elders, she speaks with the Paiute Nation members. That sort of led us to sort of some of these connections and some of our additional outreach. The project work, just to sort of, get into some of the nitty gritty pieces. This is another piece of our collection. These are sort of the state of California documents. A lot of them look like this. They are TypeScript and in some cases handwritten tables of water observation. These are usually surface water observations, discharge from dams, discharge from different sort of man-made lakes and things to sort of understand the history of how much water was where and when did this happen, and especially in an era where we're confronting climate change and confronting the social and migratory crises that are going to come from water not being where we need it to be. This was a primary motivator in our project. So these were sort of how we were dealing with these materials at first. This was a PDF, had some OCR done, but not very well. The OCR software that was used in the initial part of the project didn't really handle tables very well. So we purchased Abby Fine Reader as our sort of OCR of choice, formatted these tables into machine readable CSVs, attached appropriate metadata, and these are in process. We're depositing these into the Dryad data repository as derived data sets. Another sort of piece of the project work is dealing with some of these maps, the map georeferencing. This is a map from a 1960s era assessment of some of the municipal water districts in California. Just, it seems fairly minor, but sort of being able to place this on a map with appropriate latitude and longitude coordinates, making it discoverable in the geospatial platforms. A lot of students, a lot of researchers sort of come into water discussions spatially. They're looking at, Esri materials, they're looking at, some geo-blacklight projects, they're looking at spatial science. And if you don't have that sort of metadata, that sort of spatial metadata attached, your materials get hidden. So this is another sort of piece of the metadata and the datafying the collection activity that we did. So sort of outreach phase 2, again in tandem, we developed a survey. Catalina did most of the work on this, developing a survey that we distributed through a Qualtrics platform to attendees at different events that we participated in, sort of understanding nitty-gritty questions like this, number 3, sort of, from water researchers, what's useful to you? Is OCRing this completely and fully correct? Do you want to have better metadata that includes native place names, that includes alternate names for bodies of water? Some of these hidden elements, we sort of wanted to understand from our user community what mattered to them. We also did a lot of just focus groups and interviews, like everybody here on this panel today, right? We had to pivot to sort of Zoom meetings and Zoom focus groups. We had interviews where we could get them. We sort of sampled folks. Can you refer us to someone else? Can we have these conversations? These interview protocols and these notes are all part of sort of our shareable materials that we think are some of the most useful things that we were able to put together from this part of the project. Well, oh, that was a fade in. I didn't know I did that. Documentation and sustainability. Derived data sets, as I mentioned, are going into the Dryad data repository. We are still working on some of those pieces. We hit sort of a snag internally. A lot of the materials that go, when the data sets go into Dryad, they're assigned a DOI that's part of the Dryad Community Data Repository Service. They put a permanent identifier on that data set. We wanted to be able to link that data set to the actual document in context in our content DM instance in the Claremont College's digital library. Those items did not have a DOI, they did not have an ARC, they did not have any kind of permanent identifier. They had a URL, and we recently migrated our content DM instance, so those URLs had all changed. So this is sort of like, opening up the hood. I'm telling you that, we are struggling as a small institution, as an institution that doesn't have in-house IT. There's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of sort of dependencies that you don't always discover until you sort of into it and start monkeying with things. So the TLDR of all that is that we're waiting on depositing some of these data sets until our metadata cataloging special collections team sort of makes the decision on those ARC DOIs and starts assigning them into Claremont digital library so we can have good permanent links. That's one of the things that our community members really responded to. Like, yes, they appreciated turning these tables into machine readable data, but they really, really wanted to be able to get the full context. So making sure that link was solid, sustainable, and wasn't going to require some other project team down the road to fix was key. Wow, time is zipping by. Okay, outreach events, things that we didn't exactly plan, but with everything being everything all the time the way it was the past year, we participated in the Western Water Symposium along with our special collections colleagues. Catalina and I presented on the Collections as Data project. We were also able to invite Terry Redowl from the Owens Valley Group to speak about her community's water project. That was one of the best things we did. I'm not going to lie. That symposium was great. All the recordings are online. If you want to find out more about Western water, about the politics, about the social history, about the work of some of these indigenous groups to reclaim and reestablish some of their water rights, that's a great recording to check out. The output of that symposium, we also worked and contributed a chapter to a pressbook volume that is online at our instance. Catalina and I authored chapter 5 on this particular Collections as Data project. It fits into several other scholars' work in this volume called Wading Through the Past. It's all about water, isn't it? Project Blog was another outreach effort, was sort of designed to be an outreach tool. Let's participate in a survey, let's have a conversation. One of our graduate student workers who did a lot of our processing really got into sort of blogging about his experience and created the series A Look Inside the Data, and Kenneth was just great. He shared the tables, he shared some of the fiddly bits about using Abby FineReader. This is going to persist. We're going to keep working on this blog because we've got so much work to do, and I'm really pleased we have this blog to put it in. Oh, it's 10:30 already. Wrapping up. We're still working on the data set deposit into the repository, the workflow for maps and geospatial data that's open in another tab right now. I'm getting that up into OSF. Plan for sustainable outreach ongoing. We've had trouble engaging with folks. Related post-grant activities, we are working on curriculum development and course support. We have collaborators, particularly in environmental analysis, both with our faculty lead on this project and another faculty member at Pomona, Guillermo Douglas Jaimes, has a course called Just GIS, looking sort of critically at mapping and GIS data sets and sort of how to question and critically engage with some of that stuff. There is an inclusive metadata task force that we've been contributing to in some of these conversations about Native place names, and Native community archival and infrastructure collaboration. We lost a Tongva elder in the course of this project. The planet, the Earth, lost Julia Bogany in April of 2021. She was the first person I was told to reach out to in this project. She was the first person who responded to me. Ms. Bogany was the last meeting I had in 2020 before everything shut down. The loss to this community between Ms. Bogany and Barbara Drake, both during the pandemic, really sort of brought things into perspective. And I just sort of want to, because this is a group that I know knows libraries and tech, Julia responded to me right away on her AOL.com email address and referred me to some other tribal elders who had CompuServe email addresses. Her website, which is there, is now a bunch of tributes to her. It's a free Weebly site that a student set up for her that she's had trouble updating when I last talked to her. So next steps, I have been down sort of a rabbit hole of infrastructure for Native communities, technical support for Native communities. There is so much work to do. I don't have a clean lessons learned slide, but thank you so much. I appreciate being here, and I'm sorry this was kind of all over the place.
Thank you so much, Jeanine. And yeah, I definitely feel that loss. Thank you for your work. I'm now going to hand over to Carol for the Harvard University of Richmond project. Carol, will Lauren be speaking today as well?
No, we're going, I'm flying solo, but Lauren is with us. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Carol. Take it away.
All right. Can you see my screen? Hopefully, yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I wanted to thank everybody here from the Collections as Data team and also to the cohort. This has been a really wild ride, as Jeanine alluded to before, and I think all of us are just happy to be here together today. So today I'm going to be talking about images as data. My name is Carol Chiodo, and I am the librarian for collections and digital scholarship at Harvard University Library. I'm joined today by two of our team members, Lauren Tilton, who is assistant professor of Digital Humanities in the Department of Rhetoric and Communication Studies, and a research fellow in the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. Taylor Arnold is Associate Professor of Statistics in the Department of Mathematics, also at the University of Richmond. We are not joined today by our administrative lead, Artis Cosbiel. However, and we are not joined today by all of the people at Harvard Library and at the University of Richmond who really made this project, move this project forward. A particular debt of gratitude goes to the Images as Data Working Group, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. This is a group that met monthly, that was part of our collective governance system. And they were the team's principal interlocutors over the course of the library shutdown, a work from home pilot, a work from home directive, emergency pandemic planning, and now nearly 2 years later, a library reopening with a hybrid work model. While the team scrambled to pivot from in-person to remote and back again, the working group members, many of whom are cited in this, all of whom are cited in this list, but just to let you know, it's a smaller group than this, were really crucial in this advisory role. And I'll materials. I think you've one of the cohort members mentioned earlier, Dorothy Berry, who was also a member of this group, and we're grateful to all of the members for the really extraordinary work that they did in a time when their bandwidth was very scarce. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation, and the motivation in part is really due to sort of the numbers that we're dealing with here at the Harvard Library. We have over 78 we have over 700 staff members working across 28 libraries with 6 million digitized items. When you start to look at these numbers, you start to get a sense of the scale of our collections. And it is precisely for this reason that we were really interested in sort of tackling a project particularly related to audiovisual material that would help us wrap our mind around both this scale, but to do it in a responsible way. I personally work within the collection development unit known as the Americas, Europe, and Oceania division. We are a collecting powerhouse for Harvard Library, and we also draw on a number of special projects, particularly regarding extending the historical collections of print and political ephemera that are currently in our collections. This is just a sampling of some of the collections that you will see that we've been, some of the initiatives that we've been involved with, both at the Ivy Plus level. You'll see the video appeals to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, but also as a library, as our own entity. The Je suis Charlie collection is one such community source collection. So we've been really actively engaging in sort of thinking about how born digital ephemera or digitized ephemera might be made available. So in this light, knowing that we had plans to continue to collect materials in this area and that we were interested in doing some kind of algorithmic processing in relation to this, we really had this sort of this need to familiarize and augment people's knowledge of the impact of data science and machine learning and artificial intelligence on library workflows. And we wanted to establish some best practices for algorithmic discovery, right? We wanted to really think about what constitutes an ethical decision-making framework for these types of collections and this type of processing. And we also wanted to take the opportunity to articulate sort of our current workflows, to think about, maybe how this might be implemented across the different stages of activities within the library. So I turned in particular to the Distant Viewing Lab and to Lauren and Taylor, knowing that they had an excellent track record in developing this kind of work. And particularly, I was interested in thinking about their distant viewing toolkit, which they had developed through a grant with the NEH, and how that toolkit might be applied towards our collections. So one of the collections that was involved, you'll also see another one coming up later in the slides, but one of the collections that we did use for this was the Yellow Vest collection at Harvard Library. This collection initially started as a web archiving project. It was in collaboration with a faculty member in the Romance Languages and Literatures department. We had several graduate students, both from Simmons and from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, help us with this collection. And particularly once we started assembling this kind of work, we started thinking about, what would a born digital collection look like? And we began a pretty extensive program of outreach to photographers, both photographers and activists, to begin to collect some of the materials that were related. This is one example. I think it's a good one because this is obviously regarding protest movements. There are a lot of sensitive issues, ethical issues surrounding these types of collections. And so we felt like it would be a really good test case for us to think long and hard about what does it mean to process a collection such as this one algorithmically. I probably don't need to tell this group, this is my standard slide when I go through and talk about sort of what the processes of digitization enable when we move from tangible objects into file formats. However, I think it is still very much worth reflecting upon, in the sense that we do have all different types of processing that we can do with these collections when we make them computationally actionable. Lauren in particular has been key in sort of also shifting our focus, particularly in the field of digital humanities, from a logocentric view of this kind of work to one that is focused on images. And therefore that both she and Taylor were really ideal partners to look at these particular collections. So what is algorithmic? Where can algorithmic processing be applied for these libraries? In our experience with this project, we looked at 3 different areas, identified 3 different areas, both for current development and for future development. One of which is, of course, metadata generation, which the distant viewing toolkit does very well. Another one could be a collections discovery layer. Thinking about this as some kind of an overlay for a particular collection, much in the same way that Taylor and Lauren's project Photogrammer did to the Library of Congress photography collections. Or we could also think of this as a research service, that is a service that the libraries would provide to researchers, whether that means either providing a ready-made data set or actually providing some kind of a service in the cloud. So these are all sort of different areas that we are thinking about in terms of how we might put to work images as data. The distant viewing, I mentioned before, the distant viewing toolkit, which was what we applied to these collections. We have here the method. I think one of the reasons that we were particularly interested, or I was particularly interested in working with Lauren and Taylor on this, was in fact because they understood that computer vision could be understood as a method or a mode of communication that transmits a message between the materials of interest, that is the digitized images, and human audiences. But at the same time, these methods are created by people, and therefore they're not outside of the cultural, social, and historical ways of knowing and practices of looking. People must assign which features to look for in an image through computer vision. A human eye may be replaced by computational processes that view through numbers in order to identify the features in images, and the computer decodes in order to interpret and convey those encoded messages in the images. But at the end of the day, these are firmly embedded in historical ways of knowing and practices of looking. The architecture associated with computer vision in this particular instance with this diagram does not seem nearly as complex, and we were very fortunate to have 2 people who were very capable of unpacking the complexity of this and identifying it. They used existing models of low-level features such as object detection, regional detection, and there these are all made available also in our final report. There's a lot of literature that's associated with that. And also thinking about how this toolkit can develop new ontologies that are inflected by humanities scholarship and new models for predicting different types of features within the media. So with that in mind, and with something as complex as computer vision and bringing it into the library, we put together a tutorial initially as a Python, a Jupyter notebook, and then quickly pivoted to a collab when it became very apparent that we were not going to be able to conduct our workshops in person, and we needed substantial scaffolding, because our concern here was that for a lot of the librarians that were at Harvard, that this was going to be their first encounter with this type of processing, and therefore we really wanted to make sure that everybody felt a level of comfort and knowledge, and that their expertise could also be brought to bear on this technology. So I'm not going to go into the collab for now for reasons of time, but I would just like to point to this and indicate that this was a very, very important moment where we combining sort of a substantial scaffold to programming. Many of the librarians were able to gain a lot of insight into the processes that were occurring within the toolkit itself, within the algorithmic processing itself, and therefore were able to also better speak to then some of the questions that were that we wanted them to speak to in terms of what we needed to be thinking about before processing any of these collections. So this is really sort of one of the lessons learned from this particular encounter and from the work of the working group was really this idea of how do we know whether a collection is suitable for algorithmic processing? How can we determine that? And what are the kinds of questions that we need to ask? One of the overwhelming responses that we received from librarians at every point in sort of the library workflow of materials as they come in was that, in fact, that a practical solution was needed. They did not want to be dealing with plowing through another white paper. They wanted to be able to have something at hand that they could use. And so the idea that we started thinking a little bit in the working group about what kinds of outputs we could do when we started talking about an implementation framework that would include a decision deck. And I'm going to show you a couple of samples from the decision deck in just a moment. The idea behind the decision deck, actually, it started as sort of a decision, flow chart. We started with sort of, we're going to go through and do this flow chart. And it soon became very apparent to us, particularly, when we were talking among archivists or people in special collections or people working even in the museum, that the points of decision needed to be flexible, that depending on the collections that came in, depending on the point in the processing that someone was making these decisions, that we needed to have something that was flexible. So that was kind of where we came to this idea that we would be looking at a decision deck. We drew on the work of a wide range of work regarding ethics and the data life cycle. These are various initiatives that look at the entirety of the life cycle and have addressed different pieces of this. Some of these look at this from an feminist intersectional point of view. Others look at it from sort of firmly grounded within ethics. But these were all sort of questions that we were feeling like had to be in some way included. So we began with this sort of starting to formulate a little bit the deck on the basis of the question, the possible questions that we would be asking, what is at issue, and a really sort of concise resource that someone would be able to then point to and go to gain more information. Here is another example, for example, that we were looking at in terms of looking at these before considering algorithmic processing. So our next steps, we are looking at a pilot application of the implementation framework and decision deck to a particular collection in one of the Harvard repositories. We're interested in really getting sort of test driving this in a couple of different areas so that we can fine tune both the questions and maybe the extent of the deck. The next thing we're looking at is also the data that was gained from the algorithmic processing associated with the collections that we use will be deposited where appropriate into the Harvard Dataverse. We're also currently our user experience research office is currently conducting user research among scholars using computational methods to discern possible service offerings or the types of services that would be associated with images as data. Within the library itself, we have an ongoing images as data learning group that's associated with the tutorial that includes its own Slack channel. That's an ongoing effort. And then we've also had interest in the decision deck, applying the decision deck from several international organizations as we presented this, including the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. So I'm looking forward to actually having a conversation, further conversations with organizations such as that one and others in sort of thinking through some of the real questions that are being raised that were raised with the Santa Barbara statement and have informed all of the work of the collections as data team, and to really think about what we're doing when we are doing this kind of processing. It takes awareness, imagination, and a lot of hard work to interrogate the data associated with digital collections, let alone to fully understand the ostensibly objective ways that emerging technologies are deployed in the world today. And this is an area that I believe librarians and other informational professionals are crucial. And so we hope to continue both to further their learning journey around collections as data and the algorithms that process them. Thanks.
Oh, wait, I think I muted myself. I think I said, I'm so sorry. I said thank you to you both. and fantastic presentations. And now is the time for Q&A. Sally, I see your hand raised and you have mic powers.
Hi, thanks very much for both of your presentations. I don't know how many other people have got questions, but I've got a question for both colleagues. So I don't know if the first colleague, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get her name, but the California water lady, apologies for this, but I just wondered, I was really fascinated, sorry, Jeanine, thanks very much. I was just wondering, because you said all about the interdisciplinary work around these documents. And I saw a wonderful presentation not long ago, and I've just put a link into the chat related to the blue humanities. And it was something I wasn't familiar with. So the sort of cultural significance of water. And I just wondered if that was something that would have been involved in your project, or if it hadn't, whether this could be interesting.
Thank you. That is a great question. Yes, we sort of went into this thinking of water issues as more of an environmental STEM topic or something very technical, right? And we sort of intersected a little bit more of these humanities conversations along the way. One of our conversations was with Native scholar and historian Carrie Malloy up at Humboldt State in Northern California. And one of our questions was bodies of water, names for bodies of water in our collection. Are there indigenous place names that we should be much more mindful of? And his response was to really go cautiously in this space, because there are so many different traditions and cultural understandings of water. And some of the bodies of water in California are huge. Like there may be a dozen different names, sort of depending on how the water is engaged with and the different uses of that water. So yes, that is sort of part of the conversations we had. And it sort of, reminded us to tread carefully in this space. But yes, names for things and names for things across cultures and across languages became a huge topic of conversation.
And I don't know if anybody's waiting, but I have a question for Carol as well, but I don't want to jump in if somebody else is waiting.
Sally, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so many wonderful things in your presentation. Well, I have sort of two related questions, and I will look very closely at the decision deck as well. That's wonderful. But my question is twofold. I'm very interested because you said there was one slide where you got all the websites and everything, and I just wondered if you could say a few words about how you ingest, I don't know if that's the way, to sort of aggregate the images into your pipeline. And a kind of related question, is IIIF involved in that? Do you sort of extract the images and then sort of mark them or something before putting them into the pipeline? If I'm not expressing myself very well, but I just wondered if you could say a little bit about these, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sally, for your question. It's lovely to see you again. I saw you this morning at Europeana. This has been a very busy day for all of us. So I mentioned earlier the slide that I put up. This was the collection. The Yellow Vest collection started as a web archiving initiative. Harvard uses the Archive-It subscription service, and that was its own collection. So if you were to go to Archive-It now and look it up, you would be able to, the Internet Archive, you'd be able to find it. The Born Digital, the photography, on the other hand, was based off of the photography that we were seeing in these in this web archiving initiative. But it was through direct outreach with the photographers. I was very interested. I'm sure you know, when photographs are uploaded to social media or online, a lot of times you lose a lot of the contextual information, the EXIF data, for example. And so I was really interested in gathering that material if the photographer or activist was willing, it was gathering that material as well. So that was a large collection effort that took place over the course of more than a year, that really was was outreach to individuals. Now, there are some disadvantages to doing this kind of approach, because what happens is it's kind of like the snowball effect. On the one hand, you do have you are receiving a lot of material. On the other hand, you may not, particularly in the case of the yellow vest, you may not have sort of the broad geographical representation that you were going for, because then it tends to get a lot of, the collections are centered on certain urban areas. So we had, the urban areas surrounding Paris is a big part of the collection, and Bordeaux was another one, but we didn't have sort of the coverage just because of the who consented to having their photographs collected, and who did not. So this is by no means a comprehensive. I think I think we've thrown out the idea of comprehensive collecting, but in any case, there is something to be said about the way that also these tools allow us to envision the gaps in the collection as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to both of you for your answers. Thank you.
Great. So thank you both so much. It's now time for another break. And when we come back, we'll have our last set of presentations. So thank you both so much. Let's reconvene in the odd time of 9 minutes. Okay, right on time, and we're back. So we have two more presentations, and then we're gonna wrap on what is day one of 2 days of activity for the projects represented here. So first, well, in total, we have a presentation from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and then from a collaboration between Florida International University and the University of Florida. But first up is our friends in Milwaukee. So Anne, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, and I trust you all can see my slides.
Yes.
All right, so thanks very much. I'm Ann Hanlon. I'm the head of digital collections and initiatives at the UWM libraries. And this is our core team. So this is includes Dan Sierks, who's also here on the call. He's the director of web and data services for our College of Letters and Science. Carrie Costello was our disciplinary scholar, associate professor and director of the LGBT studies program here at UWM. And Marcy Bidney was our administrative lead, she's assistant director for distinctive collections here at UWM libraries. And our team also included Carl Holton, Jay Chen, and Ling Meng from our digital collections and initiatives department, as well as Shiraz Bathina, who's in the UWM archives, and Connie DeWitt, who is an undergraduate student, and Saida Ashraf, who's a graduate student who worked with us. Okay, so our motivation, we have a lot of motivation for why we wanted to do this collections as data project. And first off is something I think most of us are probably really familiar with. Audio and audiovisual materials make up a significant portion of the formats found in mid to late 20th century archival collections. And those materials can be especially frustrating for researchers, as well as for archivists and librarians, because to understand their content, you have to play it back in real time in order to do things like identify speakers, important topics, and relevance. So here at UWM, the archives includes its share of audio and AV materials, a small percentage of which are digitized or born digital. Actually, a pretty good amount are. But what all of those AV materials have in common is that they're underutilized by students and researchers due to those problems. They may not be well described. You can't skim them the way that you can a document or an image. And for those AV files that are primarily speech, such as oral histories, news shows, documentaries, recordings of events, having a transcript can greatly enhance discoverability and use. And as we can all imagine, create new opportunities for computational as well as traditional research. But creating transcripts at scale is expensive and time consuming. And on top of that, UWM also has one of the richest collections of LGBTQ+ materials in the country, and certainly in Wisconsin. And because these are 20th century and some 21st century collections, a lot of those materials are audiovisual. So add to that a very active LGBTQ+ community, both in Milwaukee and at UWM, who are deeply interested in their history, a robust LGBT studies program here, and an ongoing collecting emphasis in archives. And we have plenty of motivation to improve access, discoverability, and use for these collections. We were also motivated to develop new skills and workflows around machine learning tools, text analysis, and data visualization. We have had an informal relationship with our high performance computing colleagues since our digital humanities lab opened in the library in 2013. And I also run our DH lab. And Dan is our HPC person. So, but this project gave us an opportunity to really solidify that relationship and develop a real bridge from the library to research, computing, and back. So, let's see. There we go. Okay, sorry. So our project was organized around creating transcripts from the archival AV materials in our LGBTQ+ collections, using open source speech to text engines and training data, which we'll talk a little bit more about, creating a dashboard to share and demonstrate use of that corpus, consider the ethical implications of opening up some of this data, and skilling up to be able to continue and maintain this kind of work. The collections we were working with include oral histories, radio programs, cable access shows, news footage, documentaries, and recorded events, documenting a range of things from personal stories and recollections to interviews with newspapers and key individuals in the LGBTQ community to footage from ACT UP protests and news commentary. A big move for us was a transition mid-project away from the open source Mozilla Deep Speech Engine to Microsoft Azure's Cognitive Speech Services tool. We began with a pilot phase where we tested the output from Mozilla Deep Speech against a set of known human-created transcripts from our Milwaukee Transgender Oral History project. And from there, we moved into production, again, using the Mozilla Deep Speech Engine. The results were pretty fuzzy, even as Dan and his team attempted to fit the training data to the outcomes by contributing specific snippets of speech. And I'm deliberately kind of glossing over a lot of the technical stuff here in the interest of time, but Dan's on the call as well if folks want us to get a little deeper into some of these questions later. So as a demonstration, I have here, this is a comparison between an early model and a later model snippet of speech on deep speech, and then the same snippet from Azure. And so we can see all the way through, we can understand that the context has something to do with jail, but it's really difficult, certainly in the early model and even in the later model, to understand what's going on. The Azure snippet is, I think, Dan would have to confirm this, from maybe even a first pass. And you can see that even though it's not perfect, it's much more understandable and probably fairly accurate, and also includes things like punctuation. So we had planned to work with the AI for AV team at the University of Texas at Austin to do some training with them. But that was all canceled, of course, due to COVID. And so instead, we invited two of their principal researchers, Maria Esteva and Weijia Zhu, to talk about the project virtually. And one area that stood out was their market success in using proprietary speech-to-text engines, in particular the Microsoft Azure speech-to-text tool. We had access to some hours via our high-performance computing cluster, tested it out with, as you saw, excellent results. And so we struggled with this, but while Azure is not open source, the cost savings from the improved outcomes clearly outweighed the low cost of the service for our scale of operations. And we began a successful pilot to test our own outcomes. So Azure wasn't and isn't perfect, including an issue with what is called their profanity filter. This is a default setting that we found eliminated, or at least starred out, many of the terms that are key to the community and that were important for understanding context here. So turning off that filter is not a problem. It's really almost, it's just a switch. But the problem for us was referring to it as a profanity filter. That's something that's in the background, but it's still something that we think is important to address with the company. We also developed a workflow for manual corrections and detection of common errors to batch correct some terms. For example, Anthony Fauci is in there a lot, but misspelled as F-O-U-C-H-Y. And we developed a workflow to identify and correct those terms, and also when we have to correct individual terms as well. But one area of unexpected bias from the training data is that is a decidedly, it seems, 21st century training data set, which is probably not a surprise. That's likely where it's easiest to gather data from, is post-2000. And so we had consistently misidentified terms, such as the most kind of striking to us was there was a cable access show called Brand New Queer Program, which was always identified in the transcript as the Iran nuclear program. So at least it was consistent, and we were able to fix that. So Dan and I also worked together to develop metadata workflows and identify collections. Dan and his team developed the code for joining metadata and transcripts, and to develop an R-Shiny dashboard where the transcripts are now searchable and analyzable. One thing we learned during this process is how absolutely important our internal data structures are. And by that, I mean all of the talk that we've done in libraries for ages about proper file naming, thinking about how folders and files are organized, associating file names appropriately with metadata. And we found that becomes paramount when you send in a machine to retrieve the data. So it turned out that a lot of what we have is in great shape, but it definitely surfaced some issues with file renaming that wasn't documented, missing documentation, and of course, those little things like spaces and file names. So as piddly as that is, that becomes really, really important. So congratulations to us for anticipating that, right? The dashboard that we created is built using R and includes 2 discovery tools, Corpora Explorer and an LDA topic visualization that associates objects, meaning transcripts, with topic areas. So we used R for a couple of reasons. It's a flexible language that's used by a lot of people for data analysis and visualization, and it's especially being adopted in the humanities and social sciences. And I'll talk a little bit more in our community benefits section on why that was important. But the dashboard itself is where we discovered some of the most important things about the project, primarily by taking it out for feedback to a group of instructors from our LGBT studies and women and gender studies programs here at UWM. They were enthusiastic and provided much needed feedback that led to better association of metadata at the transcript level and considerations for how we developed our content warning. So we wanted to make sure, so we ended up including, and I don't think you can see it in this snapshot here, but we included a content warning that acts as sort of a pass through before you use the dashboard itself. But we were really encouraged by how easily these instructors could see integrating the dashboard into their classroom as a tool to teach not just about LGBT history, but also about gaps in the archival record, understanding how to analyze historical texts, understanding how to analyze them computationally, and using the tools to begin to look at how language changes over time. For example, that's something that they all identified as an immediate way to conduct research using these tools. It lends itself to that. And a big issue in the corpus is that terms that are now considered pejorative were often used by the community pretty liberally in the recent past or by news shows as well. So there's a way to be able to look to identify collections, look at use across collections or maybe by different actors to understand use of language over time. The topic modeling portion of the dashboard also proved to be useful for surfacing research areas that might have eluded some researchers. So for example, it's an LDA topic model, and one topic area that was identified had the term dentist at the very top, and included other terms related to healthcare and HIV/AIDS. And this surfaced the issue of dentists in the 80s and 90s, and court cases, because there were dentists, and this is, I think, across the country, but certainly in Milwaukee, who are not treating HIV positive patients. And this was news to some of our researchers. And so it became a way for them to kind of surface some areas to dive more deeply into. So we were really encouraged to see that this had some real usefulness, even as we're using kind of out of the box tools like Corpora Explorer and kind of adjusting them to our needs. So I wanted to include a little bit about the pipeline for our project. The processes for all of this are laid out here. And again, if folks have questions at the end, Dan is also on the line. And we can both answer some of those questions, but Dan, especially for some of the more technical questions. But I thought it would be good to at least include a little bit of this in our presentation, although we don't have time to closely review it. So you can see here, for example, we didn't have to do any processing of the digital files because the workflow includes FFmpeg to extract a WAV file. And so there's a lot that gets automated. This is the pipeline for generating the corpus and joining the metadata. And this is where the dashboard comes in and creating the LDA topic modeling environment. And and then setting up the Corporate Explorer part of the dashboard. And again, this is using an out-of-the-box corpus visualization tool that's built for R. So as well as adding the content warning, again, as a pass-through before viewing the dashboard. And this is all in our GitHub code, which is set up in modules to make it easier to read and to use and to understand what part of the pipeline actually that code refers to. So benefits to the wider community. We see and have also received a lot of benefits in this project. The workflows themselves, as I've described, have been designed so that they utilize open code and low-cost tools. So, you know, even though we had to drop open source Mozilla, which actually right after, I don't think I said this, right after we decided to move to Azure, Mozilla took away support for the deep speech project. So in fact, it's not something that's being actively supported anymore either. So I'm not sure that there's the same kind of open source speech to text engine out there. So alongside the project itself, we also built on, as I mentioned, an existing strong relationship between the libraries and our research computing colleagues. We gained a lot of value in this process, and strengthening that relationship and building on it are key in order for us to be able to do some of the other things that I'm going to talk about in next steps. Because we don't have a ton of staff in our library. We don't have a data services librarian. And so we don't have a digital scholarship librarian. So where we want to roll out some workshops and other skill building tools around what we've learned, we're kind of building that up ourselves and in partnership with our research computing colleagues. And it's also an opportunity for us to champion the use of technology in the humanities and again, raise the floor in the libraries for what we're able to tackle. Separate from the dashboard itself, we use the opportunity to engage deeply with the carpentries community, training 4 of our staff as certified carpentries instructors over the course of the grant, and working toward really building pedagogy into our technology work. So the whole time that we're building this, we're really interested in not just learning how to do it ourselves, but learning how to then make that technology face outward and make it possible for non-coders to feel comfortable learning something about code. Let's see. And we also learned a lot from our cohort colleagues, Taylor Arnold and Lauren Tilton, who taught 2 R for Humanities workshops for us over the course of the grant. So thank you to them. So we also plan to do a lot more to integrate AV and analysis into the classroom, even at the undergrad level where there's a lot of interest. And we hope to take this out to the community, which is an opportunity that was really limited due to the pandemic. So the annual Milwaukee Pride Fest is one of our goals for 2022, because we heard what Pride Fest was really missing was a topic modeling tent. I'm just kidding, they didn't tell us that, but we think they'll enjoy it. So next steps. So for our next steps, those I just mentioned, as well as a real integration into our archival and digital processes of these workflows. So that still needs to really be done, but we will do it. And we know how to do it now. We'll continue to develop and grow our relationships, not just with research computing, but also with the LGBT studies program, whose feedback has also really been key. We also inaugurated a community of practice in the library around collections as data with 18 volunteer members from every department in the library. And that group came out of a library task force that learned from the collections as data project and made recommendations to the library administration to ramp up work and learning around things like ethical considerations for AI work and integration of that into our information literacy curriculum. Creating professional development goals around data science, and looking at operational improvements in the libraries we can make as we all become more well-versed in some common data practices, and actually adopt common data practices across the libraries, and share our skills and work rather than siloing them in specific departments. So we have lots to do, much learned, and more to come. Thank you to the Collections as Data Part to Whole project and to Mellon for supporting this work. And that's what I've got.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. Fantastic. Excuse me. Okay, now for our, was it penultimate or ultimate? Oh wait, there, yeah, all the thank yous and claps are coming into the chat. Revel in the claps, Anne. Okay, so yeah, fantastic talk, fantastic work. So many impacts at Milwaukee. That's awesome. So I do, yeah, so my last task as moderator is to pass to the FIU and University of Florida team.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen. There we go. All right. Well, thank you all so much for having us. In some ways, it's kind of a privilege to go last, honestly, but I feel like we get to be in conversation with all of this great work that has come before us. And I've certainly throughout my afternoon noted a lot of connective threads that I'm really excited to follow up with you all on both today and afterwards. So thank you. Again, I'm Perry Collins. I am at the University of Florida, and I was the project lead for our work, DLOC as Data. I'm joined by Jill Kreft, who is my colleague at Florida International University. And we are just two members of a pretty large team for this project based at FIU and UF, but then extending to several other institutions in the Caribbean and the US via our advisory committee. So it's been really wonderful to kind of build capacity alongside a lot of these folks. I had been at UF for less than a year when we started, and now I've been here for 3 years, and I've learned a lot along the way. So it's been really wonderful. So at its heart, we launched DLOC as Data with the idea that we really wanted to think about ways to kind of lower the barrier to entry for our users and for our partners in the Digital Library of the Caribbean who are interested in a wide variety of kinds of data reuse and analysis. We decided to start with newspapers in part because that makes up about 25% of the digital library, over 1 million pages. And because we received quite a few requests over time that so far have been mediated by staff when folks were interested in bulk download of those kinds of files in ways that they weren't able to access through the main DLOC portal. So to very briefly touch on just what is the Digital Library of the Caribbean, most of the time when folks refer to DLOC, they're referring specifically to our digital library. So over 4 million pages of content, including primary and secondary sources. But of course, and I know Sophie got at this with LDL as well, that we are a socio-technical platform. We're a network of partners. In our case, 77 institutional partners contributing content to DLOC. The University of Florida is the technical host and FIU is the administrative host for this work. And in many ways, we serve as stewards and facilitators, but that partnership network sits at the heart of really everything that happens with DLOC. The other layer on top of that is just broadly around education and professional development. So thinking about services and exchange around everything from grants to teaching to preservation to copyright. And we're getting started right now on work to really strengthen those network ties and make sure that partners even who might not have staff capacity or who are just constantly affected by disaster and climate change, continue to have a strong voice in that network. So we knew the first part of this project was really about making sure we had at least tentatively finalized the scope. Which newspapers did we want to go ahead and kind of make available in bulk in ways that Jill will talk about a little bit further. And so my colleague, Hadassah St. Hubert, who has since left the project for a great new job at the NEH, she was our disciplinary lead and really took charge of kind of coding the long list of newspaper titles that we have to come up with a list of about 18 high priority titles. I'll note that all of these are part of the Caribbean Digital Newspaper Library. These have been digitized and are available online to browse and in most cases to search. But one of the core challenges that we're trying to tackle here is that the interface that we have and kind of the workflows that we have just haven't been amenable to easily downloading any of those files in bulk. And we also wrestled a little bit with whether or not to include titles that are already part of Chronicling America. So most of these titles were not part of that, since that's a US focused initiative. But we do have titles from Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands that are part of ChronAm. In the end, we did not represent those in this project. On the one hand, it would be nice to have data in one place. On the other, Chronicling America already has tools for bulk data download and through their API. One kind of priority of the project that we wanted to think about throughout was how to keep adding context wherever we could. And one thing we really didn't have was a lot of context about some of the papers. So we had a wonderful intern, our Caribbean data curation intern, Ivana Moreno, who was a senior undergraduate student at the beginning of this project. And one of the first things she did was put together a great story map with at least a kind of stub record for each of the papers in our high priority list, starting to think about kind of some basic things like when things were published or which language they're in, but also audience and positionality. That's really key and something we thought about a lot throughout this project, is that we have newspapers in this collection from the 18th and 19th century that might represent the perspectives and might have been by and for white European colonizers and in some cases enslavers. We also have 20th century papers that were established very much in opposition to those colonialist perspectives. And that made the project certainly more complex and brought up some ethical questions around, as we're talking about concepts like data recovery, whose histories are we actually recovering and who are we representing in these newspapers? And that's a very long-term conversation. And so from there, my colleague Laura Perry at UF undertook re-OCR of those high priority titles. We had digitized many of them so early that they had, we had done OCR with older software. And so she kind of updated that with the software that we now use and some of the processes that we have and passed those files on to Florida International University. And I'm going to let Jill go ahead and share her screen and talk about that process.
Thank you, Perry. And hopefully I can have as seamless of a screen sharing as you did. Okay, so you should now be seeing my screen. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we organize this collection within our repository. We decided to make our data and all of the project related materials available through our institutional data repository, which is called the Research Data Portal. And the Research Data Portal is a locally hosted instance of Dataverse here at Florida International University. And for those of you who are not familiar, though I believe many of you probably are, Dataverse is Harvard's open source software, which is designed for preservation and management of data. I will note that our repository is in its infancy. So this was really the first big project and large volume of data that we've worked with. And it provided us a lot of opportunities to explore not only the full capabilities of the system, but sort of practical lessons in making this volume of data available, and particularly for newspapers as well. So we had about 4 terabytes of data, and we worked with over 580,000 individual text and PDF files during the grant period. Some of the big advantages of using Dataverse and using the system was our ability to create a collection that had customized metadata facets necessary for the data to be easily discoverable and also accessible for bulk download, which Perry has already mentioned was really a big priority of ours. It also allowed for some contextualization of all of the data and allowed us to include our thematic data sets and other project related materials all really in one easy to find, easy to explore place. We began this process by meeting with our advisory committee to determine what they really wanted, how they wanted to be able to use this data. They really informed us on what would be the most useful way to present the data and make it available for them for download. And so there were three main points that arose from those conversations. One was that they wanted to be able to browse the data by time period or decades and geographic coverage. So we created some facets within the data set, and we structured our data in different ways in order to accommodate that. Just for sort of some context, some of our titles that are hosted and that were part of this project range from the 1800s to the present. So you may have a title that really covers a long period of time, and our researchers said, well, we may only want to really access a small portion or a small time period within that long history of that publication. The other request that we got from our advisory committee and from our researchers were they wanted to be able to download the issues 1 year at a time. So one bulk year of time download, and by the type. So they some wanted to only download the extracted text from the PDFs, from the digitized versions. Some only wanted to be able to download the PDFs. And so that really, again, informed how we structured the data. And of course, they also wanted to be able to export the metadata, which is just a cool functionality that Dataverse has. So after our conversations with the advisory committee, our initial goal, again, was to provide both the PDF and the TXT files at the issue level for each title selected. And the time and computing power that was required to collect and zip the PDFs actually proved really cumbersome, particularly because we were all working from home and we were accessing these large files remotely over VPN with varying internet speeds. And so for some of our titles, the file size of the individual PDFs were so large that we really had to make some determinations and say, okay, we cannot make available these large, high quality preservation copies. We need to do some resizing to make these a little bit more accessible. And so we had to make some determinations involved in that as well. So for example, we had 1 year of issue PDFs for one of our titles, El Mundo, which totaled over 12 gigs compared to some of our other titles where maybe a year was only 500 and something megabytes. So again, we had to make some efforts to reduce the sizes of the PDF as much as possible while still retaining a lot of the quality as well. We also, just as our colleagues at UWM, we had to take some steps to create some file naming conventions for this volume of data. Again, it was over 500,000 files that we were working with, and they were not all named consistently. So that was a big part of the project as well. And also we wanted to name them in a way that it made sense for our users. So we created a file naming convention for all of our files that allowed us to easily sort our data. So using year, month, day, and some other identifiers within the file names to help us not only sort through structure, but allow our researchers, when they bulk download it, to understand what all of those files are within the bulk download. I will do a quick, I'm gonna really test the gods right now and do a little quick demo, and just to show you what this Dataverse looks like. So this is our space within our research data portal, and you'll notice here we've created those customized facets. Here are those decade time periods that folks can search through. And I'll just click into one of the titles just very quickly, because I know we don't have a ton of time, but this is one of our larger titles, which you see spans from 1910 to 2019. And so we've used the functionalities within the system to allow folks to really easily browse by time period, but also by types of files. And we use the tagging functionality within Dataverse. And I will go ahead and pass it back to Perry to continue talking about the rest of the work we've done.
Thanks, Jill. That's great. Let me find my tab again. Oh, having trouble loading. Let's see. All right. So the other component of the project that we knew from the get-go would be more experimental, but where we really wanted to kind of test ourselves and our capacity was in developing what we termed a thematic toolkit. And really, we thought about this as a relatively lightweight kind of topical or thematic wrapper around the data, again, with a goal of trying to provide some lower barrier kinds of entry points, some places to get started, especially for users and partners who might be unfamiliar with even the concept of collections as data or the kinds of ways that you might be able to use some of the newspaper content, and who even with, as Jill shown, how easy Dataverse is to use, still weren't necessarily going to know what to do with those files. And so this turned out to be really valuable for us as a team, and also thinking about where some of our deep expertises and also some of the challenges that we had ourselves too, and where we can keep learning. So we kind of tried to scaffold some methods where we already knew we had expertise, and some that we knew would be more experimental. We focused broadly around hurricanes and tropical storms as a topic that we knew would be of wide interest to our community, but also of wide multidisciplinary interest. And where we might be able to start some conversations that could continue beyond the grant period. We kind of started with a relatively simple kind of way of pulling together text snippets that contained keywords around hurricanes from the newspaper titles across multiple languages, and kind of use those as a foundational starting point for other kinds of methods. So experimenting with named entity recognition, doing quite a bit, honestly, of just manual work and thinking about potential kind of community sourcing workflows for enhancing data and connecting newspaper coverage to the locations and people who are actually impacted by hurricanes. One project that's still kind of ongoing is the idea of categorizing. So experimenting with some machine learning work, and my colleagues, Kevin Guan and Molly Castro, really led the way on this work. So thinking about how we might be able to break down this massive data set of information about hurricanes across millions of pages of newspapers into something that a researcher might find more useful. And then kind of starting to experiment with visualization and kind of what we thought of as mini projects or mini examples to model what this might look like for folks. Kind of inspired by Sharon Leone's talk at our first cohort meeting last year, we experimented with Omeka S as kind of a relatively lightweight data navigator, kind of a way for us to add an interface to some of the data that we were working with largely in spreadsheets among ourselves. And I think some of this turned out really well and gave ways to kind of connect across places and specific hurricanes. We've at least kind of been able to model what we're thinking about. And I'm hoping that we can kind of continue to engage community members to see which aspects of this will be most useful or maybe that we should continue to build on. One question that came up quite a bit with the advisory board that seemed like a feasible one for us to kind of at least dip our toes into was, can we start thinking about juxtaposing different kinds of data? So how does our data, our newspaper data, interact with, say, NOAA hurricane data over time? And so we just developed this very small sample where we kind of juxtapose mentions of hurricanes across specific hurricane paths that we know about from the 20th century. And so that's something that's available on the site. This brought up for me, and I'll kind of wrap it up quickly here so we have time for questions, but This question keeps sitting in the back of my mind. And I guess really I would boil it down to where do we stop? So we kind of are thinking about how to make data available, make our collections more amenable for analysis. But I found, especially in talking to our disciplinary scholars on our advisory committee, they have such deep questions. And I think there is kind of an interesting conversation for us to keep having about where it's useful for us to let that data go out into the world and let others take it on and use it, rather than us trying to, say, develop a large scale project around hurricane newspaper coverage that we may or may not be equipped to do as a library. And I think that'll be interesting to kind of follow as we keep doing this collections as data work. Finally, our outreach and workshops. This was maybe the most successful piece of the project, even though it was a piece we had to change pretty radically from our original plan because of COVID. We ended up with a fairly straightforward set of workshops, but we had a wonderful group of facilitators. We ended up with 6 facilitators in all, from the humanities, from libraries and archives, all speaking in a Caribbean context. And that was just incredibly useful. Matthew Davidson, a graduate student, acted as our Caribbean community outreach consultant for this project. He facilitated a lot of this work and worked with all of the other facilitators, and has posted clips of all of the talks to our YouTube page, and that should be pretty easy to find via Google too. The themes that came out of this were really interesting. We had probably 30 to 50 or so attendees at each of the workshops, and over these kinds of threads came out, thinking a lot about ownership and ethics and who gets to make decisions about papers, questions that are really at the heart of DLOC itself and not only this project. Thinking about the Caribbean data landscape and how do we develop a community of practice around collections as data in the Caribbean and in the diaspora. Kind of reading between the lines of some of these papers, especially. I noted that some of these have really problematic content or were published by, I said, enslavers. So the Barbados Mercury is a major example of this. And we had one presentation with 3 different researchers who are actually thinking about how to recover information about the lives of enslaved individuals in that newspaper. And then also just engaging students across the board. We had a couple of sessions that were specifically for students, but throughout all of them, we had students come to the table with really great ideas who were really curious to learn. Some of them hadn't even really interacted with DLOC at all. And so this was a conversation where we got to introduce DLOC from the get-go with kind of a collections as data lens. So that was really exciting. And then finally, our next steps. We're really thinking about how to keep adding to the collection. I know Jill and her colleagues will keep adding more titles to the Dataverse repository. We're also thinking about how do we kind of connect the Dataverse repository back to that DLOC portal in more intuitive sorts of ways. We also want to really keep building on this workshop series, having more conversations, but even internally at UF and FIU, this has led to a lot of great offshoots. I think I shared some work that I've been doing around ethical rights statements for reuse with this group, and then also just thinking about our digitization workflows and other work to kind of incorporate steps that will allow us to do more collections as data work. And then finally, thinking just about teaching how to bring this informally and formally into the classroom. And I've really been inspired by a lot of the work at Arizona and other places to do that in a more formal way. So I will leave it there. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you both. I think I'm unmuted this time. So we now have a period of Q&A. So please do put your questions forward.
Hey, I have a question for you, Anne, if you don't mind. So yes, I love your project and everything about it. I wanted to ask, and this is not, reiterate, not a trick to get you to say profanity in front of all your esteemed colleagues. But I did want to ask about the profanity filter from the Mozilla tool, as well as your comment later about pejorative use of terminology that we probably wouldn't use anymore. Like, were those the same thing? Is that what the Mozilla tool was catching?
It was the Azure tool, actually. That was the
Oh, was it?
Microsoft
Oh,
Azure tool. Yeah, just to be clear. I think probably. I don't have a specific example, and it's. But yes, yeah, and it would have been just parts of just phrases and things that people. I don't know, Dan, if you have a specific example or if he's still here or not.
So I wouldn't say that the profanity tool captures the same words and vocabulary that we provide a content warning for. It's more so that there were certain phrases, right, that would be caught that we're talking about, like identity, that were different, say 20 years ago, now that there are today, and we were finding that those sort of community vocabulary like phrases were getting censored out.
Yeah, and so starred out, so there would be no way that you could search for them or turn them up in the Corporate Explorer or the topic model tool.
And it's a binary flag when you work with Azure. It's labeled as profanity filter.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you both. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
No, thanks for the question. Sally's got her hand up.
I don't know if I could just jump in. It's a question. Oh, I'm very bad with names this evening. It's a question for the DLOC colleagues. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, this is great inspiration to just browse through your Dataverse. I really am enjoying that very much. Maybe this is a US law issue, but you particularly in this session, but nobody's really mentioned copyright and the challenges related to that and the provisions of collections as data. And I just wonder, because I'm just looking at some El Mundo here, and that's until 1939. It's been published, for example, which would be really within copyright in the European context. And I just wondered how this works, or how people have dealt with copyright or providing access via collections as data to restricted materials in a copyright sense.
Sure, this is Perry. I can definitely respond to that. So, I would say in some ways we benefited in our case, and maybe most of these projects have to some extent, because we had already digitized and made available the content. Most of it had been up online for a long time. It varies tremendously, honestly, across the board. So I would say in DLOC's case, in some cases, it was with explicit permission. In some cases, materials really are out of copyright. We also tend to rely on fair use fairly assertively on DLOC across the board. And I know that varies tremendously, not only by country, but also just by institutional comfort level. We let DLOC partners make a lot of decisions about fair use evaluation as well. And so while we're there to advise, we're not there to prescribe. And so anything that we have included here is already available online. So I'd say that's like 6 different answers to your question, really, but we felt pretty confident that this at least mirrored what we were already making available.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Perry.
And I'm curious if you can if you can say more about that initial commitment to Mozilla Deep Speech and then shifting over to Microsoft Azure. Are there any other lessons learned from that you think would be useful to share?
That's a good question.
And I could provide a little more context, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
I feel like frequently in our communities, there's the focus on open data, open standards, open infrastructure, and accordingly open methods, open tools, open documentation, right?
Right.
And so to some extent, some people could see the shift to Azure as like, wait a second, that's like maybe like a little out of line with this like whole open thing. But it sounds like you all came to like a pretty like practical decision there, not as a component of cost, but then also as a component of accuracy in the work.
And also, I think ultimately a lower barrier to entry too for institutions like us. But I will say, you know, one thing that I think we gained from doing the Mozilla deep speech is we were able to kind of, Dan and his team really more, you know, get to participate in that kind of like trying to, you know, fit a training data set and understanding, you know, getting a sort of an understanding of some of the mechanics of machine learning. Which when we move to Azure, it's just doing that for us, right? On the other hand, working with deep speech, we weren't really working at a scale where we could really influence, you know, that speech to text engine in the way that we wanted to. But it was an opportunity, you know, to participate, to be a little more participatory. I think that's what we lost when we moved from open to proprietary. But I think it's much more sustainable this way. And in particular, because, you know, it just happened to coincide with then Mozilla dropping support for deep speech, which I think is something also we need to think about with, you know, the open source community. You know, most things really are pretty well supported, but in this case, this was something that just apparently couldn't be. So I don't know if Dan has anything to add to that, but that was kind of the experience.
Great. I do want to be conscious of time, right? So you've had your time now for 3 hours, and you know it's probably as much as there is to keep talking about. We should probably move to wrap up because we do have 3 hours of your time again tomorrow. So I'm going to hand things off to our co-principal investigator, Hannah Skates-Kettler, to close us out, and then also give you all a sense of what's coming tomorrow during the closed session with the project participants.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you everyone for your time and attention today, and for the project teams who have done such amazing work over the last year and a half. You've not only, I would say, energized us, but provided much to reflect on as we continue to collaborate and work together on the development of this idea and framework of collections as data. It's evolving, and you all are helping shape this. Looking forward to tomorrow. We will be taking some time tomorrow to reflect on the themes from across the cohort that have been presented here. We will be taking some time to reflect on those themes across the cohorts with your collaborators, so your team members, and we will come together to discuss and document those findings, thoughts, and ideas as a group. So later today, you can look forward to a set of prompts to the project teams from us, and a little bit more structure provided there in context. The work tomorrow will ultimately help Yasmin, Stuart, Thomas, and I as we collate all of the outputs and models folks are actively generating, as well as, honestly, our final report. So it's all building up to a grand finale, so to speak. So I encourage folks to keep track of further developments from the cohorts, as many mentioned and hinted at. This is a learning, an evolving process. So you'll hear more from them and from us, of course, regarding the spring forum and the outcomes of all of these projects here in the coming months. So until then, thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay connected.